All right, everybody, we're going to get started with our first panel of the day. If you want to come back in. So welcome to the second day of the Animal Welfare Act at 50 conference. We're going to go right into it. This is our first panel of the day, Relocating Animals under the Animal Welfare Act. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Joan Schaffner from George Washington University Law School. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, welcome back. We've already had a spectacular day of panels yesterday, and I must admit I'm truly honored and privileged to be a participant in this program. And I want to again thank, of course, Kristen, Delcy, Chris, and Callie for putting together this wonderful event. In October 2007, after months of investigation into the Bad News Kennels dogfighting operation that led to the arrest and conviction of Michael Vick, the court appointed Rebecca Huss, Professor of Law, and Phyllis and Richard Duesenberg, Chair of Law in Valparaiso University Law School, as Guardian Special Master for the 48 dogs seized, and set groundbreaking precedent to save the victims of a horrific dogfighting operation. About 2 years later, in December 2009, officials with the city of Arlington, Texas, carried out a raid on U.S. Global Exotics, seizing 27,000 animals. The judge ruled that the animals were cruelly treated. They had been confined and cramped in filthy cages and denied necessary food, water, and veterinary care, and they would not be returned. More than 1,000 mammals, reptiles, and spiders were placed in their new homes at the Detroit Zoo, where Ron Kagan is the executive director and CEO. Round of applause for all of our speakers, actually. We're just getting started here, guys. And then almost 3 years later, in August 2012, Cumberland County District Court Judge Kimbrell Teckler, in a lawsuit brought by concerned North Carolina citizens represented by PETA, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and local counsel, signed a permanent injunction that granted Ben the bear freedom from his confinement in a barren concrete cage at a roadside zoo for 6 years. Today, thanks to Carney Ann Nasser, who is now Senior Counsel for Wildlife and Regulatory Affairs at ALDF, and others, Ben resides at the Paws Sanctuary in California, where he can forage, swim, and build his den under trees. These stories set the stage for our panel today on relocating non-human animals under the AWA, and demonstrate that we could have no better panel than Rebecca Huss, Ron Kagan, and Carney Ann Nasser for this discussion. This morning, we're going to discuss the alternatives available to advocates to remove animals from situations in which they are suffering and in danger and provide sanctuary for them. The AWA grants APHIS authority to confiscate suffering animals held by dealers, exhibitors, intermediate handlers, and carriers. And legal actions outside the AWA provide alternative means for seizing suffering animals. Of course, once the animals are confiscated, resources are needed to provide adequate care and sanctuary for them. So our panelists today will discuss the legal, ethical, and logistical issues raised in the relocation of these animals. We'll start out with Rebecca Huss, who will open with a presentation on civil asset forfeiture and cost of care assessments under the AWA. Then Carney Ann Nasser will discuss the complex issues raised by the rescue and placement of exotic animals, and Ron Kagan will focus on the role of zoos in these rescues and placements. Let's get started.
Good morning. Yeah, I wait for my students usually. Good morning. So thank you for coming back in this morning. I know it was a full day yesterday. It was an exciting day, and I'm looking forward to the other panels today. So I'll just give you a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going to go today for my presentation. So we're going to be focusing on asset forfeiture provisions in the animal fighting context because of the specific provision in the AWA relating to that. And then I do have one slide that is going to help us transition into the other two speakers today. So you'll see that I'm going to specifically talk about the general asset forfeiture process because that's the process that the AWA forfeiture provision sits within. And also going to be talking about the specific provision and some legislative activity that you should be keeping your eyes and ears open for as we move forward. You know, one of the themes that we talked about yesterday, one of the things that kept coming up was what could happen now given the more, the recent election. The legislative activity I'm going to talk about actually has bipartisan interest, so bipartisan support. So it's a little bit different than what we talked about yesterday. So the first thing we're going to just talk about is I just want to make sure everybody understands that there has been some changes, especially in the last decade, relating to the animal fighting provision of the AWA. So as the slide indicates, the AWA, as we all know, 50 years ago, it didn't have any animal fighting prohibition language in it. 10 years later, that language was put in, unlawful for any person to knowingly sponsor or exhibit any animal in an animal fighting venture. And of course, because we're talking about federal law, we're talking about Commerce Clause. And just a note, my slides are pretty dry. I only have one dog slide because of copyright issues. So one of the things when I was putting this together, this is kind of a dry, technical, legal presentation, but I know all of you in the room probably have individual cases that you're thinking about, and I would ask you to think about the individual animals involved in those cases, because really, for all this technical, legal stuff, it is about each individual animal that's impacted. So now we have the ability at the federal level to bring a case relating to animal fighting, as long as there's interstate commerce involved from the law students out there, then nothing for 25 years. 25-year gap, nothing really happens. In 2002, a little bit of a change. The initial fine was only $5,000. The fine changed. The original language back in that time, there was more bird fighting. The language was changed to strengthen the bird fighting in 2002. 2007 is when things really started moving. And that's because before 2007, there was the penalty provision was incorporated in the AWA, and it was then moved to a general criminal provision. And by doing that, it strengthened the penalties by increasing the possibility of a fine to $250,000. Now, we haven't seen a fine like that in this type of case, but in theory, it's obviously a deterrent. And the possibility of imprisonment went from 1 to 3 years. Just keep in mind, keep this in perspective, at the time of the Bad News Kennels case, the federal government had to bring a conspiracy charge against the defendant there, because at that time it was still a 1-year, potential for 1-year imprisonment. So again, lots of changes really in this last decade as far as what could happen in an animal fighting case. Again, another year later, the penalty increased up to 5 years imprisonment, again, a deterrent effect. And then just a couple years ago, additional language was added to prohibit attendance at a fight, and if you cause an individual younger than 16, there's going to be penalties for that too. For those of you who are familiar with the issues relating to dog fighting, at the state level, they're doing a lot of that spectator type provisions as well, because of course it's about making sure that the demand goes down. So what's the general asset forfeiture world we're living in? We're going to be focusing today on the civil judicial part of this, but there's also administrative and criminal forfeiture. So when you start hearing, if now you're thinking about this, know that there's these other options. The administrative forfeiture is if an agency is given the particular power, they can seize certain assets. There's a monetary limit, and as long as no one objects, basically they take the assets. Criminal forfeiture is not against the property itself, like we'll talk about with the civil judicial, but actually it's actually associated specifically with the criminal case. So you may see a situation where the civil and the criminal forfeiture is happening at the same time. You can have parallel proceedings, but for what we're talking about today, we're talking about the civil asset forfeiture process. So essentially what happens is there's a seizure, of course, probable cause, and the AWA is very clear, you have to have a warrant. Seizure, there's then notice given, and keep in mind the actual case is U.S. versus approximately 53 pit bull dogs, or U.S. versus approximately 64 dogs, or U.S. versus approximately $125, $650. The dogs and the dollars and the truck and the tractor, it's an action against the property itself. Notice is given to any possible claimants that the government's aware of. If someone says, yes, that's my property, it was not used for a criminal purpose, then we're starting a process in which there's going to be an actual, you're going to go through the same process in any other civil litigation. There's going to be motions, there's going to be discovery, there's going to be hearings, all that stuff. But what often happens, especially in the case of dogs, is, and not always, sometimes people say, no, those dogs are mine, they weren't used in dogfighting, I'm going to assert a claim. The people who have been given notice don't assert a claim, and then after a period of time, the title to the animals pass to the government. So the judgment is essentially a default judgment if no one brings a claim. There are defenses associated, including an innocent owner defense, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So this is a process in which there's essentially a case against the property. The property has to have some association with a criminal activity. So something that is used to commit or facilitate the commission of a criminal offense or involved in the commission of a criminal offense. But because we're talking about a civil action, the standard of proof is preponderance of evidence, not obviously beyond a reasonable doubt, or even, as we'll see, some of the other standards that people sometimes talk about. So the general issue of civil forfeiture is quite controversial. And so you can see that there's these reasons to support civil forfeiture, but there's also lots of criticisms. And especially for any of the students in the room, you should be aware that this is the due process stuff that people are concerned about. Things like no right to notice or opportunity to be heard prior to seizure. Now, those of us in the animal law world know that post-seizure hearing is not uncommon when this type of property is seized, but it still is a concern generally with civil forfeiture. Certainly searches and seizures, right to counsel, all those due process things. There's also structural concerns that are not honestly that important when we're talking about the Animal Welfare Act seizure, but the structural concerns go to the fact that why is this property being seized? Is there any structural encouragement for people to go after this particular property because it then replenishes the asset forfeiture fund? And we can talk more about kind of the general concerns relating to due process. So again, I mentioned at the top that there is a bipartisan concerns with civil forfeiture generally, and this particular act has been around for a little bit. I anticipate we'll see something like it, if not the same language, proposed in the next session. And you can see it's a little bit hard because we've got heads in the way. These are some of the things that would be added to the act to essentially make it more difficult for the government to seize the property, make it more onerous for the government, and make it easier for especially what is referred to as innocent owners to be able to get their property back. So I just want you to be aware that there's this language out there. And of course, when we talk about changing the level of proof from preponderance to clear and convincing, that would be a significant impact if somebody's seizing dogs. So here is the asset forfeiture provision under the AWA, and the reason why we're really here today. So it's under 2156F. The language is pretty much the same as it was in 76. There's additional language now that relates to possession and training, so it's pretty broad language. And there's three basic issues that we have to deal with when we're talking about this. The first is what property can be seized under the AWA, weather costs, which is a huge issue that we'll be talking about today, and what happens to the animals in this case. So here's my one dog slide. So this photo was taken at Hopewell Animal Services in Virginia, and this dog's name is Bouncer. He was named Bouncer at the shelter because he bounced in his kennel, and he was renamed Leo by RPAC, which is a rescue out of California. This is obviously a dog I dealt with. He's a very nice boy, did chew through plastic, so he was transported by car from Virginia to California because putting him on a plane in a kennel would be problematic. And the reason why he's especially good, other than the fact that I had free copyright and could use the picture, was, here's an example of what can be seized. The only thing that can be seized under the AWA are the dogs themselves. That's really important to understand. Only thing that can be seized is the dogs themselves. So unlike other types of asset forfeiture provisions for other types of crimes, the only thing that gets seized is dogs, which reduces the arguments about procedural or substantive concerns that people are going to want to seize the dogs because somehow it's beneficial for their reputation because, or they get to replenish the asset forfeiture fund. The only thing that's seized is the dogs. Leo has actually passed away, but within a couple of months of his placement with RPAC, he was actually already a certified therapy dog. So a good example of a success story in this case. Second is cost. So the only issue with costs is that unlike what you might be familiar with at the state level, there's no bond requirement currently in the statute, and so you can only recover costs if the purported owner appears in the forfeiture proceedings or there's a separate civil proceeding. So it means that the government would have to wait until the end to try to get the costs back at this point. And then finally, the disposition issue. These are the organizations that took the dogs involved in the Bad News Kennels case. Disposition in this case is as the court may direct, and so that may be going out to a rescue, but it could also be euthanization or killing. That the big issue is the judge has to make a decision on it. So obviously we've got some limitations on the law, and there's again recent legislation relating to this. Just came out this year. It's called the Hart Act, which is smart of them to make it positive. And again, this adds some. It reduces the time period the dogs would be in limbo, which is a positive thing. Adds a bond hearing requirement. So again, the government, it obviously pushes people whose animals have been seized to make a decision. Is it really worth it for me to try to fight this or not? And obviously gets the money to the government early on. So how do we get money into the system then? Well, you can get restitution, and in the Bad News Kennels case, if you have an agreement in an associated criminal case, you can get restitution. But any fine actually goes into the US Treasury and goes to a crime victims fund that doesn't provide restitution, doesn't provide any money to anybody taking these animals. So restitution really is the key. And in fact, in a scholarly paper that I've written on this, I'm of course promoting the idea that there should be more restitution because of the issue of having costs of the placement and care of these animals. Challenging for people to, challenging sometimes because in many cases, the person whose animals have been seized they're not going to have the resources. And the restitution language specifically specifically discusses the fact that restitution shouldn't be ordered if it's going to put dependents in jeopardy, et cetera. So there's obviously some limitations even on that. So here's my transition. So we've been talking about what happens in an animal fighting context. These are people who don't want to be involved in the Animal Welfare Act. Our other speakers are going to be talking about people who have already engaged in the Animal Welfare Act. Specifically, we've got researchers, we've got dealers and exhibitors, and there's language in the regulations. It's very simple. If you pull up the language, it says if an animal, this is actually, I was pleased, the first panel of the entire conference talked about this, so we're right back where we started from yesterday. If there's a refusal to comply with a request to correct conditions, and there's suffering as a failure to follow the regulation or standards, then the USDA may confiscate the animals. The last one, the importation of live dogs, is a little bit different. It is it's when you are importing live dogs into the government, so it's not confiscation language, but it is seizure language. And in both those cases, the regulations provide that the person whose animals are confiscated or seized is supposed to pay for the cost of the placement. But obviously, that can be challenging. So we're going to move forward to our next presentation. Thank you very much.
Do you want to introduce it? Well, no, I'm just going because I introduced you. Yeah, go ahead. Good. Up and down, up and down.
remember that.
All right. Well, my presentation is going to be less legally technical, and it's going to be a happy story. It's going to include a lot of animal photos, and so you can put down your pens and pencils and just enjoy the happy ending story. We're going to go behind the rescue of Ben the bear. For those of you who don't know me, you probably haven't been privy to me telling this story over and over and over and over again, because I talk about Ben the bear every opportunity I possibly get. So when Delcy asked me about discussing what goes into rescue of exotic animals, Ben was the obvious choice. So let's see. Sorry. Okay, so Ben's case did not involve USDA confiscation. It was a litigation undertaken in order to get him out of what is no doubt an inhumane situation that was technically compliant under the Animal Welfare Act, or at least there had been no citations issued for the conditions under which Ben was living. There are so many different things that go into rescuing a large exotic animal. So this is Ben, and he had been confined in this 12 by 22 foot concrete chain link dog run at a roadside zoo called Jombas Ranch in North Carolina for 6 years. Prior to that, he'd been at another facility, a roadside facility, for the first 6 years of his life. So his entire life had been just entirely on concrete. And I think that this circumstance depicts what Paul Waldo said last night, total domination, right? There's no welfare component here. This bear was fed one single pile feeding of dog food once a day. He was used to attract tourists. He was, the roadside zoo operator would get him to do tricks to get up on his hind legs and showcase different behaviors. But Ben had exhibited abnormal, stereotypic pacing behavior for about 85% of the time, according to our experts who observed him. And yet, even under the Animal Welfare Act, with abnormal behavior being an indicator of inappropriate space or lack of space, USDA had never cited a space violation at Jombas Ranch for these conditions. They'd cited for a rusty trough, that metal trough, and they'd cited for inappropriate secondary containment, but there had never been any citations for the lack of space that Ben had here. So that's just kind of a brief prelude to getting into the nuts and bolts of the actual happy part, which is getting him out. And this was a massive undertaking. Our litigation, we got a court order to get Ben out on, it was August the 2nd. The order was entered on August the 6th. And Ben, me, our veterinarian, and Ed Stewart, the director at PAWS, were on a FedEx plane with Ben on August the 10th. So it moved very quickly. We had to mobilize. It took a lot of hands on deck. And getting a bear on a FedEx plane and getting him across country, because we're going to California with him, it just takes an overwhelming amount of consideration to attention to detail. And when you're rescuing from a substandard facility, those considerations are even more amplified, because you're dealing with an animal who's probably not had appropriate nutrition, as was the case with Ben, who has potentially special medical needs or considerations. Ben had been declawed as a cub. The containment, the secondary fencing, like I said, was completely inappropriate. This facility had no shifting capability for this bear. So as you'll see from the photos, we had to do a lot of deconstruction of the actual caging in order to get Ben out. So, like I said, these are the conditions Ben's entire life had been. Leading up to our actual departure on the plane, I spent the entire week with Ben, about 6 hours a day, at the facility with a law enforcement bodyguard, because the owner, the other consideration you have to make is, what are the circumstances under which the animal is being removed? Is it a voluntary relinquishment, or is it a court order situation that's not voluntary? In that circumstance, you can deal with a lot of really pissed off people. And so I was spending about 6 hours a day with Ben. I had been at the facility before and had, was working on a rapport with him since I was going to be traveling with him. So getting him treats, kind of just talking to him literally for 6 hours a day that whole week leading up to getting on the plane. So getting him out, like I said, we had to do deconstruction of the actual cage because there was this tall door, but once you opened it, the transport carrier, there was like a large open space. We had to actually go to a welder, find a welder to provide additional metal to block that space. I mean, there's so many different safety considerations that have to take place in order to do this in a really safe way. And so that's Ed Stewart up there trying to get the welded metal grate to stay put. So in addition to some of these other considerations, you have to have a Category 2 large animal veterinarian come and do an assessment that the animal is in sufficient health to travel. And so they fill out a form. It's not an in-depth assessment. It's just basically a visual, just eyes on the animal, signing off, asking a couple questions. Does he seem okay? He's not like foaming at the mouth or something. And they sign off, and that form travels with the animal. And this is the Form 7020 is, in addition to the Certificate of Veterinary Inspection that I just described, the transfer of the animal from the one owner to another. Let's see, wait. Okay, so in the top left, that's the interior of the caging that had been used to contain Ben. You can see it was like algae infested. It was just wet all the time, completely disgusting. This was probably one of my favorite pictures because it was after we had to deconstruct that entire part of the fence and get Ben into the transfer carrier. I went into that teeny tiny little caging area just to kind of get a perspective on what it was like to be in there for 6 years, and it was horrifying just to stand in there. The fact that this had not been cited and that this is considered, the Animal Welfare Act ostensibly is supposed to ensure the humane treatment of animals. The fact that this situation was going on for 6 years with no violation is totally unacceptable. Oops. Okay, so once we got Ben into the transfer carrier, and it took, we had to have a pitchfork and, not a pitchfork, a forklift. Whoa, yeah, forklift to lift up the carrier, which Ed Stewart had to send across country, make sure that it was the right size for Ben. We had to estimate what what size carrier would work. And of course, the owner at the time said, you're never gonna get that bear in there. I tried for 6 hours when I bought him, and we had to knock him down. It took me, Ed, and Dr. Mel Richardson, the late Dr. Mel Richardson, who we all love and miss, about 25 minutes. So just talking to him, it's peanut butter, a couple Luna bars, got him in there. We then had to transport Ben to the FedEx terminal at the Raleigh airport. And FedEx, what I should note is that they donated the cost of transport. They donated the climate controlled. If you ever see these FedEx custom critical trucks, there's some pretty special cargo in there. It's climate controlled, and a lot of times I think it's used to transport like really expensive artwork and things of that nature. Well, you may be passing a bear being transported as well. So we had the transport from the facility, from the roadside zoo to the Raleigh airport. When we got to the airport, we had to wait because the flight was not until the next morning. So we waited up all night because we wanted to stay with Ben. He did really well. Once he got into, I think that even though that transport carrier was obviously small, I think that animals can really sense when they're being helped. And I think his attitude was pretty much just get me the hell out of here. And so once he got into the carrier, he relaxed, he went to sleep, and we got on our flight. FedEx gave, rather than a number, they gave a name to our flight. They called it Bear Force One. And obviously there's a lot that goes into just getting the bear into the plane as well. We had to, they call it a cookie sheet. They slide him onto this elevated platform and put him into the cargo area with all the presents, mail, packages, whatever, but where it's also climate controlled. Once we got to Memphis, we had to make a stop in Memphis. Got to Memphis, FedEx very kindly, you have to think about so many different things, like what kind of an animal, what are their needs, what sort of temperature is optimal for their health. You can't sedate an animal who's going on an airplane either. So there's so many different considerations to make. I'm having to make this way oversimplified. But we got to Memphis. We had a 6-hour layover in Memphis. And so what FedEx did for us is they found an empty processing facility, an air-conditioned area that was completely empty. You only use it at night. And we got Ben hydrated. They brought us fruit and treats and things for him and for us. That's Ed Stewart and Dr. Mel Richardson and myself. And we hung out there. Ben was completely relaxed. And then we got him back on another airplane and made the trip to Sacramento. And the great thing about the plane was that you were able to go back and forth into the cargo area and check on him the whole time. By the way, getting permission to fly on a FedEx plane is another undertaking in and of itself. It's required a tremendous background check, and that is another thing that had to be done in about 4 days, which was a ton of work. But let's see. So we got to Sacramento, more forklifts to get the carrier out, another FedEx climate-controlled truck to transport from the airport to Paws. And then once at Paws, Ben was transferred into a 1,000 square foot den area to be observed overnight, where he had soft foliage and straw to sleep on for the first time in his life. And then the next morning at 10 a.m., he was released into his beautiful naturalistic habitat where he has a pool with a whirlpool to ease those joints from being on concrete for his entire life. And this was the moment right before he took his first step on dirt in his life. This is Ben in his pool. And this has been, I was recently at Paws with Delcy to speak at the International Captive Wildlife Conference that they host every 2 years. And we had an opportunity to see Ben. And my friends who don't know anything about animal husbandry or the work that we do say, oh, does he recognize you and come up to you? And I'm pleased that he doesn't, because Ben, for the first time, actually gets to be a bear. He's not a sideshow. Paws has done an incredible job of rehabilitating him with all these considerations, being declawed, having, his muscle tone has come back after having a horrible diet for all these years. But sanctuary selection, they're the right place for Ben. The problem now, without a new regulation that prohibits cub handling, this perpetuation, this surplus of bears, tigers, and other animals is going to continue. And we're stretching our reputable sanctuaries, our wonderful facilities like Paws, to their capacity. So we have a real dilemma on our hands, a real problem that we need to solve, because we have too many animals to place and not enough wonderful places to put them. And then it's a judgment call of, do we leave them? Do we try to improve the conditions that they're in? Where do they go, and what do we do? So Ben's one of the lucky ones. He, he's a this is the best case scenario for any of us as an animal law practitioner to be able to actually get an animal out and get them onto grass and dirt and a habitat that enables them to exhibit all of their naturalistic behaviors. So anyway, that's the happy story of Ben the bear and some of the things that go into transporting large exotic animals. I'm going to hand it over now.
Pardon me? Oh, okay. I hope that you all have had a lot of coffee and Red Bull this morning, because we are going to fly through this. Let me do a couple of quick acknowledgments. AZA, which is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, long ago passed a resolution opposing the private ownership of exotic animals. So you all need to understand that America's accredited zoos, accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, is on board with what everyone, I think, in this room feels, which is that they should not be considered property. If anything, humans should be in the role of guardians with respect to animals, and that there are many zoos, we're not the only ones, that are involved in rescues. Lincoln Park, Memphis, Omaha, the Oakland Zoo, many aquariums that are involved in rescuing marine mammals that are injured and can't be released back into the wild. The challenge, of course, is that it's very tough for zoos to take in animals like that, because often they have been, as Carney just said, in many cases they've been declawed if they're large carnivores, or defanged. In almost all cases, we have no idea what the genetic background is. We don't know if they're inbred. In many cases, they have abnormal behavior. And while there is some plasticity, often more than there is in humans, it's extremely challenging to then integrate them into a population. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is say, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be among you, because I believe the only solution, I don't believe the USDA is a solution to 99% of what's going on. I think the solution are lawyers and the media. And I know there are a lot of lawyers in here who are all trying to help, so I'm thrilled about that. I also want to tell you I'm really pissed off this morning, because we're in a battle with the Michigan legislature, who are cracking open the Large Carnivore Act. And ultimately, that would allow non-AZA accredited zoos to get involved. So imagine more roadside zoos in America, just what we don't need. But let's take a step back. And again, I'm going to go incredibly fast once I start going through these slides. We have a kind of difficult history. You know, in the old days, before zoos were public, what people did is they, in England anyway, in London, they went to the Royal Bethlehem Hospital, which is where the term Bedlam comes from. And you'd pay money and you'd go see the freaks, go see the crazy people. And if you paid extra, you could give them alcohol, and it would, you know, they'd be even crazier. When the Royal Bethlehem Hospital closed, the London Zoo opened. It's not a coincidence. Unfortunately, we like curiosities. We like to see things that are different than we are, and especially with animals. And this is where it's funny to be at Harvard, where E.O. Wilson is, but biophilia has, I guess it has an unintended consequence. It's sort of biophilia has gone astray. Because the natural selfishness in humans, combined with our affinity for nature, has created some really huge problems. And obviously, you know, you go back to the very earliest zoos, and they really were prisons. And then you go 50 years later, and you still see a bunch of stuff like this. And so, we kind of ask, well, what exactly are zoos, and are they a bit of an insight into how we view other animals? For a zoo, there's one species, and it's capturing, which, by the way, we don't do. But in the old days, that certainly was the way that animals were placed in zoos. And then we do all these things, and so the big questions are these really just centers of confinement and cruelty, or are they actually places where there is care and conservation and science and education? We think the future is a little bit different. We think the future is that they should be really reflective of the best of humankind, which is compassion. Now, I'm guessing most of you can't read this, and I told you needed Red Bull and caffeine. I just wanted to show you that this is a journey. I think it's a journey for everyone, not just for zoos. Our first rescue, my first rescues were before Detroit. I worked on getting Ivan out of a shopping mall in Tacoma, and Pumpkin, who was an orang in a Clint Eastwood movie in a roadside zoo in Texas. But the first one in Detroit was Katie the Crackhouse Lion. You're going to see a few of these in a second when I really fly through the slides. You're going to see photos of the animals. And then there was another one just a year later, Percy, who was in a basement of an abandoned house. And a concerned citizen finally went in there because nobody else would. We didn't know about it at the time. A 30-pound lion, and just took it out of there and dropped it off at the police station. And so we had Katie for almost 20 years, and Percy, and then we brought together all of the animal welfare groups and created Meet Your Best Friend at the Zoo, which is the largest off-site adoption of dogs and cats in the country. And so far we're at 22,000, I think, animals that have been saved. You're going to see a couple of these other things. We're the first approved zoo by the Sanctuary Association. We created Director of Animal Welfare position. I'm only saying these things because I'm guessing in the back you can't read. We created an Academy for Humane Education. We pushed for legislation. In 2004, we ended our elephant program. People threatened us. People told us we were going to fold as a zoo, just to kind of clear the air. We had about 1 million visitors a year at that point, and this year we'll have 1.7 million visitors a year. So the American public does get it if you actually are honest with them and explain situations. And those elephants went to pause. I encourage you to go to our website and download the film that we did with James Earl Jones that won an Emmy, Animal Showboat to Animal Lifeboat. It's all about animals entertainment. We created a humane science lab where we teach science in a way that doesn't harm animals, and hopefully teachers take that on. The Center for Zoo Animal Welfare was created. Then we did the largest, I'm going to show you pictures of that, animal rescue in U.S. history with our good friends from PETA and several others. We also created a major fund for animal rescue so that we don't have to take this out of our normal operating budget, and we're not constrained by that. Anyway, this is, again, just to quickly show you, and then the rapid fire. This is what the Center for Zoo Animal Welfare does. We felt that we really needed to provide a resource for everybody who cared about this issue. So you can now go to our website, you can do a search. Anything that's ever been published on exotic animal welfare is there. We're at almost 7,000 references, I think, now. Where is Stephanie Allard? There you are. Our director of the Center for Zoo Animal Welfare is here. We do welfare assessments, not just at our place, but elsewhere. We convene important discussions and symposia. We train people. I love our training stuff because we make people crawl on the ground where the warthog take the warthogs off exhibit, have people crawl on the ground and try to understand the world from their experience. And we also recognize advances in animal welfare through various awards. Andrew Rowan, Pat Derby, who started PAWS, several other people that you would probably know. This is the Wildlife Interpretive Gallery. This was meant to help people begin to understand what the connections are. One of my favorite pieces, we had this commissioned, this elephant, to provoke people to think about what's our relationship with animals like elephants. This is our Ford Education Center, where we have the Academy for Humane Education, and we have a humane science lab that I told you about. This is Science on a Sphere. You know, the problem for people is that cause and effect with people is a real challenge, because we need to see the effect right away or it doesn't work. Climate change takes too long, even though it's unbelievably fast, takes too long for humans to really get it. With Science on a Sphere, which was developed by NASA, no, we can actually get people to understand these things, because you can see in 100 years what happens in 60 seconds on the globe. And then we're very proud of our simulator, which has been going for a long time. And that is a way for people to become different animals and really experience the challenges that other animals have. And then finally, before I show you the rescues, we have a different idea about conservation. We're really fed up with this nonsense about the charismatic megavertebrates getting all the attention. And do I have anything against a giant panda or a tiger? Of course not. But they're not important the way these guys are. This is a Partula snail. There were only 25 left. And we, and then subsequently others, did a fabulous program, and there are now, you know, thousands of them, and they're being reintroduced into Tahiti, where one day I hope to be introduced to. This is, I only have 5 minutes, so now it goes, all the pictures come. This is Berla. She was in a circus. Thank God for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank God for PETA and a number of others that helped us imagine a polar bear living in Puerto Rico, and then in Mexico. And this is where Berla ended up. This is we have the largest polar bear facility in the country, 4 acres for polar bears, 300,000 gallons of salt water, not fresh water. That's also where our seals are, and all of our seals, every single one of them is a rescue. Some from bankrupt roadside aquariums, if you can believe there's such a thing, and others from injuries. This is the Kansas junkyard lions that we rescued. Imagine 3 lions living in a junkyard. This is a home, the 2 slides on the left, of some animals in a garage in Michigan. We took those 30 animals in. And on the right, this is hams, one of my all-time favorite animals, even though I say I never have favorites. Carney said pitchfork. You see his snout? Well, sorry.
I can't see. Oh, there he is.
You see his snout?
Yeah.
That's from a pitchfork. He was beaten up with baseball bats and then pitchforked. And again, our friends in the animal welfare community let us know, and we took him. There are lots of FedEx bears. These are 3 cubs that came from Alaska. Their mother was shot less than a mile away from the home of Sarah Palin. I'm just saying. I'm not implying anything. I'm not implying. And then, as you heard, in Texas, 27,000 animals in a warehouse. Local authorities, not the USDA, local authorities and the local SPCA, we went down and triaged for 2 months, 27,000 animals. They were in unbelievable conditions. And in fact, about 70% of them died within days. But 1,000 of them were brought to us. Many went to this place, the National Amphibian Conservation Center, which the Wall Street Journal called Disneyland for toads. I love that. This was also one of those rescues, the wallaby from that garage. And that's where that wallaby lives now, in a 2-acre area that we have for macropods. Now, you won't be able to read this, but I'm showing you 4 quick slides. 350 of our mammals are rescues. 18 of our birds are rescues. 333 of our reptiles are rescues. And 282 of our amphibians. So you see, you know, like half the zoo is all rescue. We even rescue racehorses, and that's so that we can talk about this to the public. I'm sorry I don't have the signs that we have, but we have signs up everywhere where we have these rescue animals so that people understand the issues about thoroughbred racehorses. And you see how skinny that one is. They're just, it's horrible. And this is something we built 2 years ago. We raised $2 million to build a wolf habitat so that we could rescue wolves from Michigan so that there wouldn't be an excuse to hunt them in Michigan. There, of course, are the elephants. Sometimes the rescue is to send animals away. And this is Wanda and Winky. Here are some of our partners. We're very, very proud of all of our partnerships with these groups. One of them is Grace. This is in the Congo, where we run a sanctuary for Growers gorillas. And then finally, this is just to show you the methodology, because we do a lot of science, not just the policy and rescue work. We've developed a way to understand what the situation is like in any captive environment. And so there's institutional philosophy and policy assessments that we do, and then individual animal environment assessments. All of this stuff is available to everybody on our website, and we encourage you to use it. And then finally, I want to give you a pretty picture. This is the newest thing. This is the Polk Penguin Conservation Center, by far the largest penguin facility in the world. I have been to Antarctica 5 times. I get mad at zoo people when they say stuff like this, but in this case, I will tell you, if I was a penguin, I absolutely would not want to live in Antarctica, and I would want to live here. In Antarctica, the skuas nest next to you, and as soon as you hatch an egg, they're killing it, and if they don't get it then, they'll get it as soon as it's a chick. The leopard seals are always trying to catch you to eat you. The orcas are. Finding food is unbelievably hard. Not a reason to take penguins out of Antarctica, but honestly, there are some situations where life is better. The challenge, of course, is a philosophical one, which is that if you live in captivity, you don't have agency. You don't have control and choice. And in my view, that is the single most important thing for any living organism, human, non-human. And it's a real challenge. But I would just say, we don't have full agency over our lives either. But that is the biggest challenge for any captive animal. Those of us that are in that guardian role have to do everything we possibly can to give more choice and control back to the animals. Thank you.
Well, wonderful panel here today. As you have any questions, please, there's people coming around that'll be bringing the questions up. I'd like to get us started in continuing a theme from yesterday that I think David Favors started with the AWA as a sinking ship. Besides Rebecca's discussion, really the AWA didn't come up in too much of our conversation here, and so I'm curious if the AWA did sink and we didn't have the AWA, how do you think that would affect the work that you guys have been doing?
Everybody's shy. I think we've been involved in just a couple of rescues where the Animal Welfare Act was the issue. It's usually local law enforcement agencies that are involved. I think the problem with not having the Animal Welfare Act is that it is often used in state legislation as the benchmark that you can do certain things if you have a USDA license. So if that goes away, I think it would be complete chaos. I do wish there was a lot more enforcement of the Act, and in my view, that should be switched from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Justice. To me, it makes no sense to have this in the Department of Agriculture, which is conflicted because it's promoting agribusiness, it's promoting productivity, quote unquote, of animals. How it's expected to actually be the guardian and make sure that animals are safe, I don't understand how anyone thought that would ever work that way.
Yeah, and I would just add, the standards are woefully inadequate to fulfill the statutory mandate of providing humane care for animals. And we don't have species-specific standards in the Animal Welfare Act. We have bears and tigers and wallabies, and they're all under this catch-all subpart of the regulations that we call subpart F. And when you have such vague standards that the USDA inspectors themselves don't even know what to do with, then it's a serious problem. It's a problem with enforcement, and there's talking about, we see citations for space, like issues with Ben's enclosure, which was never cited. In other cases, USDA inspectors saying, well, this animal's exhibiting this pacing behavior. The caging looks really small, but I don't really know if it's a violation, so I'm not going to cite it. And that's a serious problem. So I don't think that getting rid of the Animal Welfare Act is the answer. I think that we need to make meaningful steps towards making sure that it fulfills the statutory mandate.
All right. Well, following up on that, if you were able then to direct USDA's confiscation policies and decisions, what changes would you make recognizing resource constraints?
I think, sorry, we're going to jump in there. Yeah. I think before we, at least coming from an exotic animal protection background, before we can go there, we have to end public contact with exotic animals. We have to end that, because if we don't stop incentivizing this rapid proliferation of animals and the surplus, then we aren't going to have a place to put those animals when we need to confiscate them. So, we can talk about the end game, but we have to really deal with the issue of this out of control breeding that's happening just to warehouse, dump. That's, to me, a necessary precursor.
Well, I think Carney's absolutely right. In my view, I don't think when it comes to exotics, I think we ought to go towards a UK model where they have a zoo licensing act. I would include sanctuaries in that, but there should be an act, and then only accredited, whether it's GFAS or AZA, institutions would have these animals at all, which means the breeding would be unbelievably controlled, and we would stop the cycle. There is way too much commerce going on, and animals should not be property, and there should be no commercial activity.
I think there's been a theme that the USDA has been very reluctant to confiscate animals. And one of the questions from the audience is, to what extent do you think the paucity of good placement options is the root cause of that?
So in the asset forfeiture world, one of the things, the DOJ actually has a policy manual, and they specifically talk about the fact that you don't seize animals unless you have a plan in place. And the reality is, in the Bad News Kennels case, we had options for placement, but when you're talking about a case that came up a couple years later, the Missouri 500, where 500 plus dogs were seized, it gets much more difficult. So there's a plan in place to care for the animals in the interim period, but then what do we do with them afterwards? Obviously we want to pull them out of a situation where there is abuse, but as has already been discussed in the exotic area, we don't have a place to put all of them, even if they all are in a position that they can be placed in a rescue. So even in the easier, relatively speaking, the easier issue of domesticated animals, it's a serious problem.
There was a piece of your question that I missed. There were a couple words I didn't hear.
Oh, well, just that, do you think the paucity of good placement options is sort of the root cause of USDA's reluctance to confiscate animals?
I think it's one of the, I think there's a multifaceted problem. And so I don't think that it's just a lack of good places to put animals. I think it's a lack of understanding by the USDA's own inspectors about what they are supposed to be doing, frankly. I mean, we've had situations where we've had to do all of the legal analysis to let the USDA know that they were allowing a guy who had his USDA license permanently revoked in part for abusive training practices with big cats. And he was exhibiting big cats in a circus under somebody else's license. He was exhibiting cats owned by another USDA licensee. And we made a PETA, we made a USDA complaint, and USDA inspector showed up to the circus, and she didn't know what to do. She said she did a no non-compliant inspection report, which is not, once your license is revoked, it's supposed to be game over. And had to go through educating the USDA inspectors and just so they would understand exactly what the regulations really mean. And that's a serious problem. There needs to be more clarification of what they're empowered to do and what the meaning of the act really is. So
That's there's a question here regarding whether in the Ben the Bears case, was there any legal action taken against the USDA inspector who did not cite any violations? So is there any mechanism for actually enforcing what the USDA inspectors do and taking action against them individually?
Well, there is legal action to challenge the USDA's automatic renewal of licenses, and that's been something that has been challenged, the policy of just rubber stamping license renewal. A USDA licensed facility should have to demonstrate that it's in compliance with the act before getting its license renewed, not just at the outset before they have their inventory of animals.
Right.
It's completely ridiculous. So very little that can be done with respect to individual inspectors because of the broad authority that federal agencies have in their anything that's related to law enforcement. And so because citations and determining what is a violation or a non-compliance falls under that law enforcement broad authority, it makes it very difficult to challenge in that way. We have to go about this in other ways.
Mm-hmm. There's sort of a dual question I want to ask. I mean, one question from the audience is large animal welfare organizations have recently begun buying out roadside zoos, then putting them in U.S. sanctuaries. Do the ends justify the means? And of course, relating to ends justifying means, I want to even open that up a little bit more broadly. We do know that there's far more animals, as we've all indicated here, that are being kept in violation of the law than there are reputable places to rehome them. And so given this disparity, do you think it is appropriate to kill an animal that might be the more humane choice than either leaving them where they are or putting them in some substandard situation? And how would you address those, both ethical as well as legal questions? Do the ends justify the means?
I'll do the first question. In terms of buying out, I think that there have to be a series of circumstances that are met and ensured before buying out a facility. You don't ever buy an exotic animal from a bad situation unless that entity is going to get out of the business of doing it altogether, because otherwise you're feeding into the problem. So there's in the situations where roadside zoos have been bought out, they've had they're struggling financially, they're getting out of the business. And so there's criteria that has to be met before that's a wise choice. But in those circumstances, those criteria have been met. So,
and I'm sure the people in the room, that's an issue that comes up a lot with puppy mills too.
Yeah.
And I know that one of the ways that they try to deal with it, not just is having them sign contracts saying they won't be getting back in the business. So the individual organizations that are involved with the shutdown to try to ensure that issue. But it's from an ethical perspective, there's just, as you know, a lot of controversy involved in that.
But no one wants to unpack exactly what that controversy is.
No.
No?
I don't.
I think about the first rescue that we were involved with the orang from a roadside zoo in Texas, and the animal was ill, and the owner had contacted us and asked for help. And I said, we'd be delighted to help, but you have to sign the animal over to us. And he said, why on earth would I do that? I said, because there are two scenarios. One is that we come down and save your animal's life and also maybe make you look good. The other is we'll send the media down and make your life really miserable. And so he signed over the animal. I think I don't believe in paying for hostages, which is what this is equivalent to. So we've never done that, and I don't think we ever would. But it does still beg the question that there are obviously far more tigers in private hands than there are in all accredited zoos combined, like 10 times the number. So this problem is not going to be solved with one stroke of the pen. But I think what Carney said earlier is critical. We've got to stop, by all means, grandfather, but stop the ability for anybody to breed them.
Sort of shifting gears a little bit, this is kind of, I think, an interesting, particularly from a lawyer's perspective, how do we change the status of animals as property when we rely on tools like civil forfeiture that are based on animals' property status? You want to take that, Rebecca?
Actually, I think about this a lot. I wrote a totally different article on the use of pit bull-like dogs as service animals and whether that actually reinforces the property status of the animals, because the animals, a dog that might not be able to be in a jurisdiction just to be a dog, a household pet, would be allowed in a jurisdiction because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the challenge is we're just so far from changing the inherent status of animals. And so, it certainly is something that I am concerned about, but at least in this context, the civil asset forfeiture context, at least in the AWA, they do treat them as a special type of property in the fact that the disposition is different than the other types of property. She's giving you 5 minutes. So from that perspective, there's already some recognition that it's a different type of property. What I'd like to see happen is I'd like to see there be more changes in the Animal Welfare Act provisions in the civil asset forfeiture to clarify that there is this distinction. And that's when we talk about this legislation that's coming down the pike. To me, it makes sense that we treat the sentient beings that are seized differently, that the time period is shorter than other types of property, and that you might have to do a bond when other types of seized property you don't have to do a bond, because it's a different. I don't want to keep reinforcing the property, but it's different than the car or the truck or whatever.
I think that for those of us who do exotic animal protection, we're lucky in a way because at least we have something to work with. With farmed animals, there's literally pretty much nothing. And it encourages a creative use of whatever tools you have. So, whether it's dealing with local laws. I was an assistant city attorney for a large metropolitan city before transitioning into animal law, and I'd never imagined that my land use and zoning background would be so useful in animal. I thought, gosh, there's years of my legal career that I can just, waste of time, right? Well, we're talking about tigers in basements and things like that, then that zoning experience has actually been very useful. And so we have to be creative in identifying where inroads we can make. And that's one thing about animal law that is, I think, that's the fun part for a lot of us, is that we're encouraged to be creative, which is not typically the case with a lot of practices.
Well, and just a quick follow-up, there's always this tension between how do we help this individual animal? And that's a lot, animal law is, unlike environmental law, which is more ecology sometimes, we're talking about this and Ben. Right. What do we do to help Ben versus does this then push us farther back from making real change in the future? It's obviously a dilemma that we're not going to answer in the 2 minutes we have left.
Right. Well, with 2 minutes, I'm sorry, we can't get to all the really great questions, but you mentioned being creative. And yesterday we had a panel in terms of other laws that intersect with the USDA. And so the last question I think I'll use for Carney is, have you been able, and you mentioned you were at the CITES conference, have you been able to use CITES to remove wildlife from any problematic situations? Is there any?
Well, so CITES sort of underpins the international treaty, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. It is, it's sort of what underpins our Federal Endangered Species Act. And so it pertains to the international trade, how animals can be used commercially and traded internationally. And in our Federal Endangered Species Act, that applies to those things, whether it's import, export, or interstate sort of commerce and certain uses of animals. And I think, this is diverted. Now we're headed to Endangered Species Act away from Animal Welfare Act, but we have a lot of work that we need to do in terms of identifying what commercial uses are and being able to make sure that the purpose of that act is also being fulfilled, because there's certainly a lot of what I deem to be purely commercial uses of exotic animals that have been allowed, and they're, the loopholes for meeting enhancement of the species or showing that it's not for primarily commercial purposes have been very much distorted.
Well, actually, Fish and Wildlife has, as I said a little bit earlier, has been incredibly engaged in helping. And a couple of years ago, they confiscated 1,000 turtles in a suitcase at the airport in Detroit, which we then took, and were able to care for some and send others on to other accredited zoos. And there are very real animal welfare issues there. It had, the Animal Welfare Act wouldn't kick in, but because, gosh, it's only a turtle. But they actually are very engaged in trying to be helpful with the rescue of animals. Those turtles were on their way to Asia, and you can understand what was going to happen to them there.
Well, thank you. We're out of time. Please thank this panel has just been spectacular. Thank you so much.